There's a generation that survived something no other generation could, and psychologists are just now realizing how mentally unbreakable they actually are. Born between 1965 and 1980, Generation X makes up the smallest adult generation in America, yet they hold more leadership positions, report lower anxiety rates, and demonstrate higher stress tolerance than any generation before or after them. But here's what researchers at Stanford just discovered: their childhood created a psychological profile so resilient, it's being studied by the military. And when you see what they endured, and how it rewired their brains, you'll understand why they might be the toughest humans who ever lived. Let's start with the data everyone's ignoring. A 2023 study from the American Psychological Association found that Gen X has the lowest clinical anxiety and depression rates of all living generations, despite experiencing more childhood adversity than Millennials or Gen Z combined. Between 1970 and 1985, the divorce rate hit 50, meaning half of Gen X grew up in broken homes. Both parents working became standard for the first time in history, creating the latchkey kid phenomenon. Over 40 of Gen X children spent hours alone every day after school, no supervision, no safety nets. They microwaved their own dinners, walked home alone, and solved their own problems before age 10. But here's the twist: neuroscientists now say this wasn't damaged. It was training. Dr. Bruce McEwen's research at Rockefeller University reveals that moderate stress during childhood actually strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and resilience. Gen X didn't just survive neglect, they developed what psychologists call stress inoculation. They learned to self-soothe, problem-solve under pressure, and operate independently in high-uncertainty environments. Meanwhile, they watched the Cold War unfold on TV, lived through the AIDS epidemic, survived the crack crisis, and entered the workforce during a recession. Every major traumatic event became psychological conditioning. And unlike later generations, they had no internet echo chambers to amplify fear, they just dealt with it and moved on. But the real proof of their mental strength? Look at what they're doing right now. A Pew Research study found that 47 of Gen X are simultaneously raising children and caring for aging boomer parents, the so-called sandwich generation. They're managing this dual pressure while holding down careers, surviving multiple economic collapses, and adapting to technology they didn't grow up with. And they're not complaining about it. They're not posting mental health struggles on TikTok or demanding workplace accommodations. Why? Because their brains were literally wired for endurance. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's work on stress biology shows that early life adversity, when not extreme, creates adults with higher cortisol regulation and better crisis management. Gen X doesn't panic. They adapt. So why is Gen X the strongest generation of all time? Because they're the only generation that had to be. They didn't get participation trophies, they got independence. They didn't get safe spaces, they got survival skills. They didn't get therapy culture, they got grit. A 2022 Harvard study found Gen X has the highest financial stability, lowest substance abuse rates among middle-aged adults, and the strongest work-life boundaries of any generation. Here's the bottom line: Gen X isn't cynical, they're tested. They're not emotionally distant, they're self-sufficient. And they're not lucky. They're psychologically forged in a way no generation has been since. Because when you grow up having to save yourself, you become unsinkable. And that's not a weakness. That's strength in its purest form.